I want to welcome everybody here today to the first of 4 JuSt Lunch for this semester at the Schusterman Center for Judaic and Israel Studies. I probably know most, well, my faculty colleagues I certainly ought to know and do know, but for the students, German students in the audience, and I'm Alan Levinson, I'm the director of the center, and the first Wednesday of every month, we try to have one of our faculty colleagues, either in Jewish Studies, Israel Studies, or not, either at OU or not, share some of their work and share some of their research. I think this has been going on for 25 years, and it's a wonderful way. Really, I think it's a wonderful way for colleagues to get to know each other's work, and for students and members of the community to get to know who's doing what at OU. For students, I think especially, a lot of us teach stuff that is very general or really not connected often to our own research projects and research. And so I think a lot of our students, you know, just know us from our classes, and most of us have research interests beyond that. So this has always been a really nice program for that purpose. In addition I might add that after Professor Lemon today, we are going to have next month Professor Lisa Wolf, who's up at Oklahoma City University. I often say maybe the best Hebraist in the state. She's going to be speaking on the book of Ecclesiastes from a feminist perspective. She just authored the feminist companion to the book of Ecclesiastes. The month after that, Professor Lindsay Katzir, who teaches at Langston University, but works on a lot of Anglo-Jewish authors and not so Jewish Anglo authors. She's going to be speaking about Charles Dickens' Jewish characters. And then in May, Professor Ronnie Grinberg, who is a professor of American history and American Jewish history with great interests in gender and masculinism. She's going to be speaking in May about her work. So we have quite a nice lineup for these JuSt Lunches. You're all invited. We love to see you. In addition to that, we have a couple of other speakers, one-offs. We have our annual Yedida Kaufman Stillman Memorial event on March 11th with Amy Pelletier from UT. She'll be speaking on March 11th. All of this will be via Zoom, of course. March 25th, Ted Merwin, who has written a couple of terrific books on American Jewish culture, including Pastrami on Rye. We were going to partner with Hillel and actually provide pastrami and deli sandwiches for everybody. Unfortunately, we can't do that. There's OU Hillel trying to admit themselves. But we can't do that, obviously, because of the pandemic. But at least we'll get Ted to speak. We have Dan Schwartz doing at least one musical performance. He's a composer, conductor in OU Music School. He's quite a wonderfully creative professor and individual. And so I believe, despite the limitations that we're all working under and living under these days, I think we have a pretty interesting program this spring. I'll also be hosting 3 movies starting next Wednesday night, 3 movies in a row on the 10th, 17th, and 24th. And every year we look for a theme for a film festival. This year, I have called it a little cheekily Speaking in Tongues. They're going to be Jewish tongues, and there'll be 3 films, one about Ladino, one about Yiddish, and one about Hebrew. So I think I found the best film in each area. and you're all, everything we do is free and open to the public. So you're interested to spend an hour and learn a little about Ladino or Yiddish, please, you're very welcome. So that's it. That's our program for the spring. And I really, again, I know we all get a little tired of Zoom, but let me remind you, this started as a JuSt lunch. So bring a brown bag. I already ate mine because I was hungry, but bring a brown bag with a sandwich. Put yourself on mute. You can eat an apple, which, during our JuSt lunches in person, I would feel rude munching on a Granny Smith because they're so loud. But no reason in the world that we can't take some advantage of our quarantine lives. So bring a sandwich and tune in. Okay, I want to since Professor Lemon, I'm going to call him Bob from here on in, since we're friends. Since Bob just got done teaching, and quite a few of you have to go teach at 1, I'm going to make the introduction to our cherished, witty, erudite colleague brief. Bob is in addition to the affection the students have for him as a teacher and disaffection as an Arsenal fan, but well, those of us who care about these things. Bob Lemon is best known as a professor of German. He joined OU in 2005, specializes in the literature and the culture of turn of the century Austria. His 2011 book, Imperial Messages, Orientalism as Self-Critique in the Habsburg fin de siècle, it's a wonderful book that examines Orientalist fiction by such famous and still, I think, well-known authors as Hugo von Hofmannsthal, Robert Musil, and of course, Franz Kafka. Last year, with Joe Alberti and Genoa Davidson, Bob translated and adopted Franz Kafka's famous novel, The Trial, as a stage play, which was performed here at OU. It was just fantastic. This year, he's working on another Kafka translation and adaptation, again with Joe Alberti and Genoa Davison, an audio drama of the topic of today's talk, Franz Kafka's The Metamorphosis. So without further ado, Bob, take it away.
Well, thank you very much, Alan. I appreciate it. And thank you very much for the invitation. And thank you all for being here. I realize as I now switch to hopefully sharing the screen, you can all hear me okay? Yeah, good, excellent. Let me hit share screen and okay, just a second. I realize what I need to do is, make this bigger. That's what I need to do. All right, just give me 1 second. Okay, I realized that my choice of topic for JuSt lunch is abysmal, and a more unappetizing individual, a verminous creature, so to have to encounter such a being at lunchtime is really poor timing on my part. So I apologize in advance if I'm putting you off your lunch, and instead of being JuSt lunch with Bob Lemon, it becomes not even lunch with Bob Lemon. Anyway, let's I think what I'm going to do, because I'd sort of like to let me hit share screen and just make this work. 1 more minute. 1 minute, folks. Play from start. Okay, and just a second. Let me just hit this and okay. 1 second for the share screen to work. Okay, share. That should be working. All right, so apparently I can't do this with a larger screen, but there we go. I'm going to move this up here so I can see it better and see you. All right, good. Just give me 1 second. All right, can you all see that okay? Yep, no? Okay, let me move that down. Just 1 second. Let me see.
You moved it up, it disappeared.
When I moved it up, okay, so I'll be looking down here. All right, and you'll be up there. Okay, so let's start. That's better. So let's, by way of introduction, let's talk about where this project fits into a sort of larger trajectory in terms of research. This is part of a larger project looking at Kafka's whole oeuvre, all his works, and thinking about the question of anthropology. How do his texts refer to this field of anthropology? Because it seems to be a constantly recurring theme in many of his works. But of course, if we think about the Metamorphosis, anthropology seems to be misplaced. After all, anthropology is the study of humankind. And Gregor Samsa is famously transformed into an inhuman insect in the very first sentence of the novella. Of course, he retains his human interior to a lesser or greater extent, but certainly he seems to have a dubious purchase on being a member of the human race after that moment. But I would argue that his liminal position, his threshold in between state, between being both human and animal simultaneously, enables the text to do several interesting things. Firstly, we can reflect on what it means to be human, and not in a sort of very sentimental fashion, but in a quite astute anthropological fashion, from that perspective. And there's a potential, and I would stress the word potential, to achieve an external, independent, and unimpeded objectivity towards his humanity in that liminal state of being transformed externally into an insect. Secondly, I think we can also talk about look at this text as signaling a wider development in the culture, particularly a transition from a traditional ritualistic communitarian type society and culture to one of modernity, and particularly hyper-capitalist modernity. And I think this text dramatizes and explores that very fundamental change. And finally, and this kind of responds to the first point, the text uses Gregor's unique perspective to explore what I would call the anthropologist's dilemma. How can you, as an anthropologist, observe human beings without, in your humanness, impinging on the conditions that you want to observe without having an influence, right? This is the sort of classical anthropological vision we have, for example, when a European anthropologist goes to, let's say, Papua New Guinea and lives amongst the indigenous population. Of course, that anthropologist is going to have a massive influence as an outsider and will never be able to see the everyday conditions without, of course, influencing what's going on by his or her very presence. Okay, so let's go down a little bit. Now, this question of ritualistic tradition versus capitalist modernity. Can you all see that okay, by the way? Can make it a little larger. Is that better? Yep. Okay. We have it, the notion of ritual comes up in the very first sentence. I'm just going to read the one German sentence. This is it. Als Gregor Samsa eines Morgens aus unruhigen Träumen erwachte, fand sich in seinem Bett zu einem ungeheuren Ungeziefer verwandelt. When Gregor Samsa awoke one morning from uneasy dreams, he found himself in his bed transformed into a monstrous, verminous creature. So that's my translation. Now, this word that has confounded translators for generations now is Ungeziefer. And an Ungeziefer is essentially a vermin, a verminous creature, okay? And it's not limited to species. It's much more a sort of relational term for how this species, or these different species, interact with human beings. They've got to be parasitical and they've got to be pests. And this applies to birds, it applies to insects, it applies to rodents, anything that we want to get rid of, that's comes under this term Ungeziefer. Originally, if we go back to, I think, Middle High German, there's the verb zehrbar, and it generally means an animal worthy of sacrifice. Okay, so an exalted animal. You don't just sacrifice any old animal to your god, do you? You need something that's going to make a statement. And this is the idea with Ungeziefer, that these animals are not worthy of sacrifice originally. Okay, notice the term transformation appears in the very first sentence. He's transformed. I insist on actually calling it the transformation whenever I get the chance, because that's much closer. Metamorphosis implies some sort of natural event, like a tadpole becoming a frog or a caterpillar becoming a butterfly. That couldn't be further from Gregor's absolutely inexplicable and rapid descent down the evolutionary ladder. Okay, it's not the same thing at all. I think transformation is much closer, but that's a canonical mistake now, and it's very difficult to talk about the text without referring back to whatever the Muirs did, the initial translators did to it. But I'm going to argue here that Gregor is sacrificed. He's sacrificed by his family, who condemn him to death by starvation because they threaten he threatens rather their income. But they're not sacrificing to a Judeo-Christian God. Rather, they're sacrificing him to Mammon. They're sacrificing him to the ideology of capitalism. All right. Now, this conflict between ritual, traditional society and modernity plays out during Kafka's lifetime. His dates are 1883 to 1924. He died at the ridiculously young age of 40, tuberculosis. And in his community, or rather in his religious community, there's this interesting conflict between two different groups. On the one hand, you have the world that Kafka came from, the world of the so-called Westjuden, or Western Jews, who were thoroughly assimilated, thoroughly established in many of the metropolitan centers of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Remember, of course, Kafka's Prague, when he was born, was in Austria-Hungary. By the time he died, it was in the new Republic of Czechoslovakia. So these Westjuden, and you can see in the photo, we have actually, as representative of the Westjuden, Kafka's family itself, right? Including his father and his mother, who's seated in the center, and his sister and brother-in-law and nephew, etc. And you can see from the dress, if we compare them to the Ostjuden on the right, you can see a radical difference. I mean, the Ostjuden there in the Leopoldstadt in Vienna, same sort of period, 1913 versus 1915. They're wearing Hasidic garb. They're what we might call Orthodox now, and very, very identifiable, as opposed to the much more assimilated, westernized Kafka's. And the brother-in-law, I think, is even wearing a dinner suit, isn't it? They're both wearing dinner suits. Interesting. Okay, so there we go. Now, this conflict, this sort of conflict between co-religionists within these two different Jewish communities. By the way, the Ostjuden are arriving in large numbers because they're fleeing persecution in the East, especially. They're fleeing places in the outskirts of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, like Galicia, which is now Ukraine and Poland. And they're fleeing pogroms, and they're coming to the large metropolitan centers, and their co-religionists, the westernized Westjuden, are looking at them askance, because in a sense, they've left this behind. It's almost sort of like a cultural version of the return of the repressed, right? They're very much, especially someone like Hermann Kafka, Kafka's father, very keen to leave that past behind and don't want to be reminded of it. Now, this comes to a head in the Kafka household through the figure of Yitzhak Lewy. That's our next slide. He was a Polish-Jewish actor, born 1887, murdered in the Treblinka extermination camp in Poland in 1942. And he becomes friends with Kafka in the period 1911 to 1912. Okay, and he's one of the actors in a Yiddish theatrical troupe, and they had this residency in Prague during that time. And Kafka writes the Metamorphosis under the direct influence of this friendship. Okay, they become good friends, influence one another. We've only got, I think, one letter from Kafka himself to Lewy, but for example, at the Bar Kochba Society in 1911, Kafka delivers a talk on Yiddish. He calls it jargon or jargon, and tries to sell it to his fellow German-speaking Jews in Prague by saying it Yiddish preserves lots of interesting medieval forms from the Middle High German. But here, what's interesting for us is that we have a generational conflict that cuts against the grain of history. It's the younger generation, represented by Kafka, Franz Kafka, who are very keen to reconnect with their lost traditions, their lost past. And it's the previous generation, represented by his father, Hermann Kafka, who have assimilated to a lesser or greater extent and want nothing to do with this life of the shtetl, life of the ghetto, this traditional ritualistic life, okay? And this conflict appears in the famous documents, the Letter to Father, which is 103 pages long. I don't know how I'd feel if my son wrote me a missive that was 103 pages long. I think I'd feel that I'd failed as a father. Never delivered, of course, to his father, written but never delivered. Published 1950s, much later, way after Kafka's death in 1924. But it's this meticulous, almost painfully acute description of this incredibly fraught relationship between a very sensitive son and a very overbearing father, right? For example, one of the stories is that Hermann Kafka grabs his son late at night, who's whining for a glass of water, picks him up, shoves him on the balcony, the family's home in the middle of the night in the cold, and leaves him there for what's, I'm sure, felt like an eternity. And this is one of those sort of biographical moments that people cite in relation to all those various interlopers who come knocking at the door in lots of Kafka's narratives, particularly, for example, the trial. Okay, so this text refers to his friendship with Yitzhak Lewy, and we have the actual quotes here. Hermann's response to Yitzhak Lewy. Without knowing him, you likened him in a terrible manner that I have already forgotten to vermin. And as so often with people dear to me, you automatically had to hand the old adage about sleeping with dogs and waking up with fleas. Okay, this is Franz Kafka responding to his father's insulting of his close friend Yitzhak Lewy. Okay, now you'll notice the word Ungeziefer appears in the German, as it did, of course, in our opening text, in our opening of the text, in the first line of the novella itself. This verminous creature appears. Okay, of course, Gregor does not wake up with fleas, but as an insect. That metaphor is concretized even further. Okay. But what it allows Kafka to do, and here I'm going to offer several readings of the figure of Gregor as an enormous verminous insect, because I think it's a classically multivalent metaphor that has all sorts of possibilities embedded within it. But I think for our purposes, thinking about its relation to his father, to his Jewish heritage, his complicated, attenuated relationship to Jewish ritualistic tradition, it allows Kafka, on the one hand, to express his father's contempt, his father's sort of Jewish self-hatred for what Hermann Kafka saw as the primitive, dirty shtetl in the East, and Kafka's own self-loathing at his lack of Jewishness, his sense of being assimilated and his family having assimilated essentially for reasons of socioeconomic success. So the metaphor of vermin, of course, comes up. It's being here employed by a Jewish father to condemn his son's friend. But of course, the metaphor of vermin already contains within it the notion of extermination. What do you do with a pest? You get rid of it. Okay. And so that, of course, we think about how the 20th century will progress. We think about how these anti-Semitic tropes will be enacted during, of course, the Holocaust. And of course, the Holocaust will annihilate all of Kafka's family. Now, the question is, of course, how on earth can the Zamzas be Jewish? Okay, if we think back to a signal moment in the text, there's a moment at the end after Gregor's death where they ostentatiously cross themselves, right? Which seems obviously like a totemic Catholic ritual, right? There are some clues, there are some suggestions, I would suggest, in the text. Zamza itself as a name is Hungarian. It's derived from Samuel, which is obviously a Hebraic name in the Hebrew Bible. And in some ways, and this is sort of typical of Kafka, the Judaic element in the Zamza's makeup is honored in the breach. It's honored in its violation. It's referred to in its violation. So Gregor is constantly breaking various commandments. He takes the Lord's name in vain on several occasions. His very first meal as an insect involves meat that has been cooked in a cream sauce, amongst various other delicacies. So breaking the dairy and meat edict, the dietary edict, of course. And in some ways, Gregor fits into a pattern of various hybrid creatures that we see throughout Kafka's oeuvre. We see, for example, Red Peter, who is a talking ape in Report to an Academy, or we see Jackals and Arabs. Sorry, that should be the English title, Jackals and Arabs 1917, in which we have talking jackals in the middle of what appears to be possibly Palestine. And in some ways, he's constantly playing with this idea of assimilation, of constantly being in two cultures at once, and playing with anti-Semitic tropes by presenting these human-animal hybrids. And if we take Max Broad's word for it, at least, he's writing actually in the journal, The Jew, Der Jude, in 1916 to 1917, although the word Jew never appears in his, Kafka's works, they belong to the most Jewish documents of our time. So it seems to me that we could argue, given this name, given the references in violation, if you like, to dietary laws and to the Old Testament, to the Ten Commandments, rather, we could argue that there has been a conversion. There's been a conversion amongst the Zamzas earlier, before Gregor's transformation. And just as Gregor's transformation is incomplete, he doesn't become internally an insect, so the Zamza's conversion has not quite taken. Now, this sign of the cross, I would argue, does not belong to either tradition. It's not Judaic, it's not Christian. I would argue that the sign of the cross is in fact much more like the plus sign. They are re-entering the world of accumulation at the end. they're now being able to make a profit, and they're able to add additions to the family through the daughter, Greta, who's in the meantime has blossomed into this beautiful young woman, and they're thinking of marrying her off and adding to the wealth of the family and adding to the numbers of the family. So biological and economic reproduction and production are absolutely going hand in hand. All right, how are we doing for time? Good, okay. Now, I think one of the ideas that is very important for thinking about this transition from a traditional ritualistic culture to modern hyper-capitalist culture is the notion of time, how we experience time, how we apprehend time. Okay, Gerhard Neumann, who's a preeminent Kafka critic, describes Kafka's poetics as being derived from the disintegration, alienation, and extinction of ritual processes. Okay, now this applies particularly to modernity. Modernity and modernism conceives of itself as separate from the past constantly. It rejects tradition. It sees itself as the result of a rupture with the past. And that can be seen as tragic with the loss of tradition, or it can be seen as heralding a brave new world that breaks with all those stuffy 19th century conventions. But we see it specifically in Gregor's own apprehension of time. Okay, we see the shift from religious, ritualistic, festival-based sense of the passing of the seasons to the modern notion of time based on timetables, train timetables. Okay, by the way, the train timetables are what is going to enable all those soldiers to be sent off to the front with that alarming efficiency in the First World War. Okay, so this is how it will manifest itself. And of course, that Kafka's text is written in 1912, but published in 1915 after the start of the First World War. Now, the question is, how would you respond if you woke up to find yourself a giant insect? I think any sane person would lose their mind instantly, right? You'd kick and flail with your little jerky legs and scream bloody murder. This is not, I can't stress this enough, this is not how Gregor responds. His instant response to seeing his segmented abdomen, feeling the hard carapace of his back on his back, of the shell on his back, seeing his tiny flickering jerky little legs, his immediate response is to blame his work. This must be an illness brought on by work. It's a symptom of the deeper malaise, right? And if we look at the text here, this is Susan Bernovsky's translation. Good Lord, he thought, what an exhausting profession I've chosen. Day in and day out on the road. Work like this is far more unsettling than business conducted at home. And then I have the agony of traveling itself to contend with, worrying about train connections, the irregular, unpalatable meals, and human intercourse that is constantly changing, never developing the least constancy or warmth. Devil take it all. Okay. So here, his immediate thought is that this must be connected to work. Okay. Right. Okay. And he obsessively follows the ticking of the clock. Here, I'll just quote the second half of this first quote on page 10. It was 6:30, and the clock's hands kept shifting calmly forward. In fact, the half hour had already passed, and it was getting on toward 6:45. Okay, so what we have here is an interesting question of narrated time versus narrative time. There is no way in the space of half a sentence that 15 minutes can elapse, but we get that sense of panic because Kafka is an absolute genius at the contraction and expansion of space and time through subjective, the subjective apprehension of those dimensions, right? So his paranoia, though, is kind of justified. It's always justified in Kafka. I mean, everyone's paranoid and everyone has damn good reason to be paranoid. It's the general manager. The general manager suddenly turns up at his house to check why Gregor missed the early train, okay? And the mother tries to engage the procurist, or the general manager from the firm. He's sort of the head clerk, if you like. And this is how she describes Gregor's temporal obsession. Why else would Gregor miss his train? The office is the only thing the boy thinks of. It really bothers me that he never goes out in the evening. He just sits at the table with us, quietly reading the newspaper or studies train timetables. Okay, that's how he spends his time in the evening, thinking about tomorrow, thinking about work, the job that he hates, of course. It still fills up every aspect of his being. Now, the general manager also has an interesting view of time, and he's worried about Gregor's productivity. He says to Gregor through the door, of course, he hasn't seen him yet. He hasn't, rushed out in terror at the sight of this insectoid creature emerging from the bedroom. But he says to Gregor through the door, your productivity of late has been highly unsatisfactory. Admittedly, this is not the best season for drumming up business, but a season in which no business at all, that should say, is drummed up is something that does not, and indeed may not exist, Herr Samsa. Right? So we have the sense of the commercial year does not adhere to any kind of holidays, any kind of festivals, any kind of interruptions, right? It must be continuous and uniform. Okay. Now, by the end, something has gone seriously awry with Gregor's timekeeping, with, if you like, the Gregorian calendar. Okay. At the end, he's drawn by his sister's violin playing out into the living room where the family is seated with the renters. By this point, they've brought three eerily identical lodgers into the house for money. And of course, the sudden unexpected appearance of this disgusting neighbor drives those lodgers away and leads to the final crisis in which Gregor is condemned to death by starvation. But here, he's being drawn by the music, almost magically, by his sister Greta's violin playing. And he's determined to go up to her and tell her that he'd had the firm intention of sending her to the conservatory, and that if the disaster, i.e. his transformation, had not disrupted his plans, he would have made a general announcement last Christmas. Christmas had passed now, hadn't it? Without letting himself be swayed by objections of any sort. Okay. So here we see he's become completely dislocated, completely unmoored from the passage of time. Okay. He doesn't know if Christmas has passed, which is a heartbreaking line, because also it starkly outlines his ostracism, the fact that he is not part of his family's community, he's not part of the wider cultural community. He doesn't know whether this important festival has happened or not. Now, after his death, it transpires that we're actually at the end of March. So not late December, the end of March instead. So we're not in the season of births and nativity, we're in the season of sacrifice. We're in the season of Passover and Easter. And so without that work, and I think we can all identify with this a little bit in our age of COVID-related lockdowns, we don't know what day it is. And Gregor doesn't even know what season it is, let alone what month it is, okay? So on the sort of microcosmic level, we see this change in the apprehension of time, which I think is very typical for the early 20th century. Now, he's got another hobby, apart from poring over timetables and fretting over schedules. He worries about, his other obsession is woodwork, particularly fretwork, decorative woodwork. And he's produced something, he's made something that he's got on his wall. Above the table, where an unpacked collection of cloth samples was arranged, Zamza was a traveling salesman, hung the picture he had recently clipped from a glossy magazine and placed in an attractive frame, an attractive gilt frame. The picture showed a lady in a fur hat and a fur boa who sat erect, holding out to the viewer a heavy fur muff in which her entire forearm had vanished. Okay, so this is a very interesting illustration that Gregor himself has cut out from the magazine, and it will recur in the text as well. We'll return to this. It's a literary reference. It's a reference to Leopold von Sacher-Masoch's short novel, Venus in Pelz, Venus in Furs, which was also an inspiration for a song at the end of the 60s by the Velvet Underground. And interestingly enough, when the protagonist, who enters into this masochistic relationship with the Venus of the title, enters into that relationship, she dubs him Gregor. So we have the name connection as well. Okay. Now, this is clearly a literary reference in terms of the content of this picture, but I'm interested in the process. I'm interested in the process of what it means to clip an illustration from a magazine and place it in a special frame and put it on your wall. What is going on here? What does this mean? And I think to really appreciate what's happening, we need to look at a theorist. I'm not going to use much theory here, but this is one that I think is absolutely, this is a text that I think is absolutely relevant for appreciating what's going on with Gregor's weird interior design. And this is Walter Benjamin, German Jewish Marxist cultural critic. He's writing in 1936 about the work of art in the age of mechanical reproduction. And for him, the aura of the artwork is its presence in time and space, its unique existence at the place where it happens to be. A mechanical reproduction annihilates that aura. Okay. Interestingly, the aura in previous times before the advent of mechanical reproduction, I think particularly in classical and medieval times, is associated with the cult. Okay. And this is the third quote down from, third quote down. We know that the earliest art works originated in the service of ritual, first the magical, then the religious kind. It is significant that the existence of the work of art is never entirely separated from its ritual function. But Gregor Samsa decontextualizes this image. He cuts it out of the mass-produced illustrated magazine. He makes a special frame for it. He sticks it on his wall in the position where, for example, many of the Czech Catholic families in Prague would have a picture of the Virgin Mary or a crucifix. And he makes it the votive image of his bedroom, okay? And by doing so, he restores, to some degree, the aura. Now, what does this mean in terms of his devotion? And we see it later to this image. It's thoroughly acute and very telling. Now, it manifests itself, Gregor's devotion to this image of the woman in furs, when his sister, Greta, and his mother are busy removing furniture from his room. And they're doing so to enable Gregor to engage more fully in his new hobby, which is climbing the walls and the ceiling of his room. Okay, I always think of Lionel Richie at this moment, dancing on the ceiling, or Fred Astaire danced on the ceiling as well, didn't he? Yes, and he sees this image. Most of the furniture's already been removed, and he sees this one picture left on the wall. His eyes lit on the picture of the lady clad all in furs, conspicuous now on the otherwise empty wall, and quickly he's made his way to it and pressed himself against the glass, which adhered to him, pleasantly cool against his hot belly. At least this picture, which Gregor's body now covered up completely, was absolutely certain not to be taken away from him. And then later in the same passage, Greta's intentions were perfectly clear to Gregor. She meant to bring their mother to safety and then chase him from the wall. In the meantime, mother's seen him and fainted dead away. Well, let her try. He sat there on his picture and would not give up. He'd sooner leap right into her face. Okay. So what we have here is a really interesting question of how Gregor is preserving his humanity. And it's a violent, bestial, animalistic defense of his humanity. He's going to spring and attack his sister from his vantage point on the wall. Okay. And what does his humanity consist of anyway? He spent his time gazing at this mass-produced image of a woman instead of, engaging in actual biological reproduction, right? He has no emotional life. He has no fulfilling emotional connection or sexual connection because work consumes every moment of every day. And what's interesting, of course, is that Kafka himself declared that this text should not be this figure of the insect should not be reproduced. And this is what I mean by the idea of a bug in the system. Gregor points to the absurdities of capitalism while being part of that system and yet outside that system by dint of this bizarre insectoid exoskeleton. Okay, let's go on. I think I've got about, how are we doing for time, by the way, Alan? Are we doing okay? Shall I finish in about 3 minutes?
That would be good. That way people can ask
give
some
it 10
questions.
minutes. Yeah, I'll finish in about 2 or 3 minutes. Okay. Now, we have this moment, which is very important for thinking about Gregor's humanity. It's the moment, and you can see it in this quote. I won't read the whole quote, where he is drawn by his sister's playing outwards into the living room. And we have this rhetorical question: was he a beast that music so moved him? Okay. He felt as if he were being shown the way to that unknown nourishment he craved. Okay. So he is attracted to his sister. He dreams of locking her away with him. He dreams of using his horrific figure to scare away anybody who would attack them. I mean, this is Beauty and the Beast. This is a gothic, incestuous vision, okay, of, and yet at the same time, it's also aesthetic appreciation. It's also the altruistic purpose of sending her away to the conservatory. It can't be both these things, right? And yet it is. And I think that's a very telling moment in terms of looking at the contradictions that exist in the figure of Gregor, how he can be both a bestial monster and an altruistic brother who's moved by his sister playing music. All right, so we can talk a little bit. I think it's probably less important to think about his lack of imagination. Gregor could rely on his inner resources. He could take this moment of enforced indolence and think about his past. He could retreat into an inner life. He doesn't have one. His memories of other people he rejects because they cannot help him. He has an entirely transactional view of the world around him, a bit like certain inhabitants of Mar-a-Lago. Anyway, we have a sense in which everyone is alienated. The lodgers are barely human. They're three identical men with identical beards who say the exact same thing. Their leader says something and then they repeat it, all three of them. And they are undifferentiated. They don't have individual names. And they seem to act as a weird hive mind with no individuality. So this applies to Gregor, to Gregor's family, in their failure to recognize his humanity as well. Okay. Now, the last point I want to get to is this idea that Gregor actually, from his vantage point, acts as something of an ethnographer. And by ethnographer, I mean someone who is observing closely This is a field of anthropology where you observe closely, through close field work, a particular group by living with them. Okay, that's the term ethnography. And this applies to Gregor. Okay, his father injures him with a thrown apple, which is a wonderfully redolent biblical metaphor. He's not able to climb anymore, which was his great hobby as an insect. And instead he observes his family. And he observes them as they're lit, almost like a stage from his point in his dark bedroom where they can't see him. Okay, so for a moment we get this insight. We get this, of course, it's always impeded by his presence. His very presence has enabled that, or has absolutely influenced their lives. But what we do get is this moment where he notices and sees their position. Okay, and so we get a sense that this very claustrophobic text is opening up. They, the other family members, were fulfilling to the utmost the demands the world makes on the poor. Gregor's father fetched breakfast to the petty employees at the bank. His mother sacrificed herself for the underclothes of strangers. His sister ran back and forth behind the shop counter at her customers' behest. But this was all the strength they had. Okay, it's a very interesting moment of editorialization. Okay, and it comes from this direct observation. And so Gregor, the text begins with an awakening, and yet it never blossoms into a full political consciousness. And this is partly, I think, because Gregor himself occupies all the abject positions associated with capitalism. On the one hand, he's a verminous vagrant who's been ostracized by his family and made to live in the junk room amongst all the filth and the hair and the detritus. He's also a parasitical bourgeois. He's living off of his family just as they lived off him. And finally, he's a hapless drone, okay, at least initially. So this is why I'm using the term bug in the system. This bug in the system, the inexplicable absurdity of Gregor's transformation, makes us question the premises of this capitalist system. And his ideology is as unfathomable and inescapable as his exoskeleton. And so finally, I just want to say a few words about the transformation, our current project, which I'm working on with Joe Alberti and Genoa Davidson. This is an audio drama. I think Kafka speaks directly to the age of COVID in terms of the themes of containment, contagion, and capitalism. And more than a century later, I would argue Kafka's text still has the power to wake us all up with a start. Thanks very much.
Thanks. If everyone could, yeah, give
Yes.
us.
Sorry about overrunning.